Good morning, everyone, and welcome to AAA Houston section SpaceGeekSpeak. Today, we are for an amazing presentation. Welcome to a journey that ventures beyond the bounds of Earth's gravity into a realm where human resilience and ingenuity are tested to their limits. Today, we delve into the critical subject of keeping humans alive in space, a challenge that pushes the boundaries of science, engineering, and human determination. Presenting this captivating exploration is none other than Julie Strickland, a name synonymous with innovation, dedication, and a deep-rooted passion for space exploration. With a mechanical engineering background, fueled by a childhood immersed in the rich tapestry of science fiction, from the iconic voyages of Star Trek to the profound narratives of Asimov and Bradbury, Julie has spent nearly 2 decades at the forefront of aerospace innovation. Her journey is not just one of personal achievement, but a testament to the human spirit's boundless curiosity. Holding 5 patent awards, with many more innovations in the pipeline, Julie embodies the essence of forward thinking and problem solving that our endeavors in space demand. Her upcoming book, Strawberry Innovation, The Practical Guide for Innovating Within a Fortune 50 Company, promises to share the wealth of knowledge and experience she has accumulated over years of pushing the envelope of what's possible. Today, Julie will guide us through the unseen challenges of keeping humans alive in the void of space, from the nuances of physiology and microgravity, where every breath, heartbeat, and bone is influenced by the absence of Earth embrace, to the ingenious designs of habitats and spacesuits that make survival possible. This presentation is a tribute to the exploration of the cosmos. As we embark on this journey with Julie, let us open our minds to the complexities and triumphs of human space exploration, reminding ourselves that the vastness of space is not just a challenge to overcome, but a canvas for our greatest inspirations. Please help me welcome Julie Strickland to the stage. Julie, your stage.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I super appreciate it. And thank you everyone for getting up so early on a Saturday to hear me speak. I love that each and every one of you is here. First, did y'all know that we found this on Mars? Back in 2004, when Opportunity landed, this was what was going across the atmosphere, across the surface of Mars. And man, that sure looks like a bunny to me. And the way it moved looked like a rabbit to NASA. And so we got very excited. We thought we'd found life on Mars. But upon closer examination, it was found that this is actually a piece of trash. So this was actually a piece of insulation that had come off the landing pad and was blowing across the surface. So unfortunately, this is not an example of life on Mars. Now, this is one from Mars, and one from the moon is a face. And so at first, we thought that there might be statues left by aliens telling us to go to those particular areas, just like the pyramids, obviously built by aliens. However, when we examined more and had better satellite imagery and closed in on those places, it was found to be craters and rocks, and were not actually faces at all. This is an example of anthropomorphism and pareidolia. I'm sure I'm slaughtering those words because I'm not an English major, but the ability to see faces in camouflage is actually an evolutionary trait to keep us alive. So just think about it, our ancient ancestors had to be able to see the tiger hiding in the brush, even though it was camouflaged, to stay alive. And so that's why we see faces where there may not be any. But I thought these were fun little ways to start talking about life on other planets. But we're really here to talk about humans. Oh, but first let's talk about tardigrades. So these tardigrades, they are actually itsy bitsy, about the width of human hair. And they are, tardigrades are also called water bears. They are very resilient. Now, they're not extremophiles. Extremophiles will actually adapt to an extreme environment and flourish there. Tardigrades will go into cryptobiosis, which is like hibernation, and they can live in a vacuum. And they can live in a vacuum. They can live in the highest upper atmospheres on Earth. There's been life found in the deepest oceans and the highest pressures. Anywhere there is water on Earth, life has been found. Tardigrades have actually been found in cement walls, in brick walls. So I posit if we find life everywhere there is water on Earth, and we have found water on the moon and water on Mars, there's a potential we'll find life there. It may be microscopic, like our friends, the water bears here, but there's always the potential to find life. So that's why scientists get so excited when we find water on other planets. But we're here to talk about humans. So here's a picture of me in zero gravity. I was actually honored to take a zero gravity flight earlier this year. And so I was able to experience weightlessness firsthand. Now, weightlessness, it's so different than floating in a bathtub or in a swimming pool. In a swimming pool, there is the buoyancy force of the water actually holding one up. So one's body feels a little pressure. In zero G, there's none of that. And even though we were told that swimming would do no good, I still tried it. And they were right, swimming does no good because there's no water to displace in order to move me along. And it was the weirdest sensation. It was like being tossed in the air and those few brief seconds in the air where there was nothing holding me up. So it was really cool. But we're going to talk about, if I had stayed in weightlessness longer, some of the physiological effects that I might have experienced and some of the effects that the astronauts actually do experience on the International Space Station. And I'll talk more about myself later in this presentation. But first, let's imagine the very most ideal experiment. If we could take a person and clone him or her and send one to the International Space Station, keep one on Earth, that would be an ideal experiment. Now, we don't clone people here in the United States, so the closest we have to that is a twin. As you may know, identical twins are formed when the fertilized egg in its mother's womb splits. And so both individuals have identical DNA. They're not identical people, they have their own personalities, but the twins have identical DNA. So Mark and Scott Kelly, pictured here, became astronauts, and NASA said, let's do this twin study. So they sent Scott up to the International Space Station for about a year, 340 days. And every time they gave Scott a flu shot, they gave Mark a flu shot. Every time they studied Mark's eyes, they studied Scott's eyes, et cetera, for this entire time period. And they found a lot of the effects that we'll talk about in a minute. So there weren't too many surprises. However, the one thing that I thought was really cool was that Scott was younger when he came home. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, we all have chromosomes, and on the end of our chromosomes are telomeres. And our telomeres are longer when we're younger, and they shrink as we age. And when they measured Scott's telomeres, his were longer than his brother's, such that would indicate a 6-month time period. Now, we should all go to space. It's the fountain of youth, and we'll live forever. Maybe not. Look, there are some other effects of space travel on that pie chart on the right. And so we're going to get into some of those. Space brain is a number of symptoms that have different causes. So when mice were irradiated, they showed degraded cognition, erosion of the neural structure, all sorts of brain damage. And those mice, take that with a grain of salt, because they gave those mice a lot more radiation than we would normally see in a typical space mission, astronaut visit on the International Space Station. However, Scott Kelly also indicated some degraded cognition whenever he returned from space. Let's take that with a grain of salt as well, because Scott was tired from his trip. He was going from public appearance to public appearance, and there were other factors involved. In addition to that, Scott is one data point. Scott and his brother Mark are one set of twins, whereas as scientists, we appreciate repeatability. We want to have lots of different data points so that we can extrapolate findings. So we need a lot more twins to join the astronaut corps, NASA, so that we can do a lot more twin studies so that we can actually understand the effects we're seeing. But space brain is a real thing. We talked about radiation effects. Now let's talk about microgravity effects. People have experienced motion sickness on the International Space Station. Now, this can be countered and has been in studies where they put the astronaut on an exercise device like the stationary bike and have him or her look at a screen for 2 hours while they exercise. So they're looking at a fixed point and exercising, and that helps. It also helps that on the International Space Station, they signify this is the floor and that's the ceiling. In microgravity, it doesn't matter. You can float upside down, you won't feel any different. Well, that messes with people's brains. And so by signifying that floor, these are the walls, this is the ceiling, it actually helps people orient themselves and feel less motion sick. And then there's the Earth out of view phenomenon. People who are far, far away from home experience anxiety, depression, hallucinations. Well, guess what? Prisoners in solitary confinement in prisons have experienced these same symptoms. So is it that they're far, far away from home, or is it just the isolation itself? More studies need to be performed. The Apollo astronauts had Earth out of view when they were on the dark side of the moon, Michael Collins being the first one, but they were there for such a short time in their orbit. They were busy performing scientific experiments and looking for their friends down on the planet that they didn't really have time to experience this. So at the moment, it's a hypothesis, not a fact. But it's interesting that between microgravity, physical location, and radiation, there's a number of symptoms that are all lumped under the title space brain. Now, the overview effect is the positive side of being away from the planet. And I want to play this video for you because I just think it's the best thing ever. And it's also best to hear from an astronaut instead of just hearing from me.
Seeing the Earth from above, from the outside, with your own human eyes, changes you as a person.
The space between the surface of the Earth and the top of the atmosphere, and it's such this thin little sliver, and that's the only place I've ever been before now, and now we're gliding above it, and so you feel removed, but you also feel connected in some regards. So there's all of these thoughts and emotions and sensations that hit you all at once.
It was the first time that I had the perspective of how big Earth was out our window, and that we were no longer on it. This was really the first time that I thought, wow, we are looking back at Earth. We are no longer on Earth.
When you live on the station, you're a resident, and everyone who's lived on the station feels that way. We are residents of space, and we have hundreds of experiences that are burned in our psyche forever.
Seeing the world as it is, the fragile, thin atmosphere that keeps us alive, that makes Earth habitable, it makes you appreciate this beautiful rock that we get to travel through space on.
This experience is so unusual and so different than anything you've ever done in your life that it's hard to grasp it all.
I'd never imagined in my entire life getting to see something that beautiful. It was so foreign for the human mind to look at that, to see that total black of space, to see the Earth highlighted that way.
There's an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the experience that so few humans have had to be off the planet and look down and appreciate how beautiful it is and how perfect it is. We're so fortunate to live on such a perfect planet, positioned where it is in the solar system.
It is heart-stopping. It is soul-pounding. It is breathtaking.
Wow. Transformative is the word that I kept hearing about the overview effect. Now that was named by Frank White. And the first American spacewalk was actually performed by Ed White. Now, Ed White, psychologists were afraid that he was going to go insane when he stepped out of the capsule for the first time. The first American to step out into the vastness of space with nothing below his feet, nothing within arm's reach. And they were so concerned. Of course, they were concerned from the first launch, but especially with the first spacewalk. And Ed stepped out of the capsule, and it was like he was in a cosmic bathtub floating there. But they'd also given him an experiment to perform. It was a maneuvering gun. And so he could fire the gun and he would go in the opposite direction, because as we know, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So Ed stepped out of there and he was like, psh, 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 flying all over the place, having a good old time. So whereas scientists on Earth were afraid that he was going to go crazy, he didn't want to get back in the capsule. White, get back in the capsule, please. White, this is mission control. It's time to get back in the capsule. Quit firing that gun and get back in the capsule. Finally, he did. But by the time he did, he had performed something like 34 minutes of a spacewalk, which beat the Russians' first spacewalk, which was something like 12 minutes. So I could not find any genealogical connection between Ed White and Frank White, but it was just kind of fun that they have that connection in history. Now let's talk about some of the smaller effects of space flight. You can actually grow in space. And I put this in quotes because you're not actually adding mass to increase your height. No, what's happening is there's no more gravity pulling you down. So the gravity is pulling me down right now and compressing my vertebrae into 5'4" approximately. Now, if I were to go into microgravity, the gravity wouldn't be holding those vertebrae together, so they would separate somewhat, and that would result in up to a 2-inch gain. By show of hands on the reactions, how many people would like to be 2 inches taller? Yeah, I'm sure some of us would like that. So unfortunately, that shift of the vertebrae can cause back pain. Now, I put an asterisk on that because there have been studies that shown that the back pain might be caused by other things. There's some differing theories. The truth is we only have like 12 people going into microgravity every year. So there aren't enough data points for us to confidently extrapolate information. But I do know that fluid shift is real. So my heart is pumping and my heart is countering the effects of gravity. Gravity wants my fluids to come down towards the earth. My heart counters that to make sure that my brain gets enough oxygen. Well, in space, the heart's still doing its things. It's still pumping as hard as it can to get those fluids up, but there's not gravity counteracting it. And so the result is puffy head and bird legs. So one gets a puffy face and the legs actually tend to atrophy and have fluid loss. And because of that congestion in the head, it's like having a cold. It's not as easy to taste or smell. And so foods that taste really good on Earth don't taste so good up there. And so hot sauce is at a premium on the International Space Station. Let me tell you what. Unfortunately, there's also calcium loss from the bones. And then there's muscle atrophy. The good news is most of these things are reversible. The fluid shift kind of equalizes out in a couple of weeks of being in space. The fluids redistribute, and but there are some other effects as well. So yay, we can go into space and get younger and be taller, but there are some trade-offs. Now let's talk about fluid dynamics for a minute. Alan Shepard was the first American to be launched into space, and he was supposed to go on a 20-minute flight. So he's supposed to go up and come back down. 20 minutes, easy peasy breezy. Well, because the American engineers had never launched a human on a big fiery missile before, they were concerned. They didn't want to blow up an American hero. So they checked and they double checked and they went through their checklists. And Alan's 20-minute flight became more like a 4-hour flight. Mission control, need to urinate. Mission control, situation's getting urgent. Mission control, really, I need to urinate. Well, they didn't have a toilet in there for him because again, it was supposed to be a 20-minute flight. So eventually he just had to relieve himself. And thank goodness he had thick cotton boxers on, and it was a very dry environment in the cabin. So the urine evaporated quickly, but we discovered the need for diapers for the astronauts. Now we call them maximum absorbency garments. So MAGs, to make them sound a little bit more manly. But yeah, the astronauts all wear MAGs. But on the International Space Station in microgravity, astronauts can't feel the need to go potty. Now let's talk about that for a minute. When my bladder is full, gravity is pulling that fluid down, and it's basically sitting on a sensor that tells my brain, hey, you need to go potty. Well, if you're in space, fluids act differently. So instead of being pulled down, they're going to have surface tension and they're going to coat the inside of the bladder. And the astronauts don't feel the need to urinate. Well, what does that mean? That means that whenever they pass the toilet, they go because there's always something in the tank. Otherwise, they have to schedule their bathroom breaks for number 1 and number 2, by the way. And just for funsies, I put a picture of NASA's new space toilet. Doesn't that look comfortable? Well, the good news is you're not actually sitting on that, you're kind of floating above it. So it's not as uncomfortable as it looks. But yeah, there's a vacuum hose for number 1 and there's a bucket for number 2, basically is how that works. Here's another example of fluid dynamics. If the water were just in the air without a surface to coat, it would form a sphere, as Christina Cook is showing right there. And the fluid shift that we talked about that causes puffy face and bird legs causes swelling in the back of the eye and pressure on the eye, which can either cause a flattening or some sort of shape change of the eye. And I've seen anywhere from 45% to 70% of astronauts are affected. And that results in vision degradation of up to 1.5 diopters. So there are a bunch of glasses sitting around on the International Space Station that astronauts can use, but they might also experience stocomas or cotton wool. Stocomas are blind spots. Cotton wool are kind of like lesions on the eye that are often seen in diabetics. They can also experience headaches. The good news is some people recover. Note that I didn't say all. Some people recover, so they recover their eyesight once they return down to Earth. But this is a real thing. It's called SANS, Space-Associated Neuroocular Syndrome, SANS, which is interesting because SANS is the French word for without. So you can think of this as without sight. But 1.5 diopters, yes, while it's measurable, reading glasses are usually that or lower roundabout. So it's not incredibly terrible. Now, bedtime on the International Space Station, we don't want astronauts floating around hurting themselves and possibly equipment. So they strap themselves into sleeping bags, such as those shown here. Now, some astronauts like the feeling of floating. They find it very relaxing. Others want to feel a weight whenever they sleep. So they might strap bungee cords across themselves. And I've even heard of foam blocks being Velcroed onto the head so that they feel like their head's on a pillow. Now, how would you like to have to strap yourself down to go to sleep? Sounds kind of extreme, right? But also, because of all of the radiation in space and the protons and the neutrons flying around, astronauts see bright lights and wake up. Now, I asked them if they see these bright lights while they're awake, and they say no, because they're looking around and there's light, ambient light, so they would notice if there were, protons hitting their ocular nerves. But when they're asleep, it can actually wake them up. I found that very interesting. So they're scheduled for 8 hours of sleep a night, but on average, they get 6. All right, let's talk a little bit about me. I've got about 20 years in aerospace. I've worked at some of the bigger companies in the aerospace industry, from Raytheon, L3, Northrop Grumman, and I've had a variety of titles. Svetlana talked about my book. My 3rd book is coming out later this year. I'm a speaker, as you see, innovator, etc. Notice that none of those are biomedical. I'm not a doctor. So what I've presented to you here has been from my own experience, from interviews with astronauts, reading books. I am a space enthusiast. I have studied space my whole life. As Mrs. Hansen also said, I was raised on a steady diet of Star Trek and science fiction by my awesome brothers who raised me right. So if you were interested in any of these topics, I'd encourage you to do your own research and to see what those emerging studies say. And please connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed this presentation, I'd love a recommendation. That helps me get the paid speaking gigs. So I appreciate all of that. But why did I name my company Strawberry Innovation? Because innovation is like a strawberry. You notice that strawberries have an irregular outline. Innovation is rarely straight and to the point. You usually learn something and go off in a slightly different direction, like the irregular shape of the strawberry. You see those black marks on the strawberry. Some people, I mean, they look like flaws or scars, but actually those are seeds. And the seeds of innovation are all around us. But that stem reminds us that we don't just make ideas don't come to us in a vacuum, pun intended. We actually learn and research and think about things, and from that knowledge, the idea grows. And think about timing. If you pick a strawberry too soon, it'll be sour and won't be ripe enough. If you pick it too late, it'll be rotten. It'll be past its prime. You got to pick it at just the right time for it to be juicy, for it to be useful. So ideas can be timely. If, for example, right now, if I thought of an idea for a cell phone, well, that's great, but they're already in use. So you got to do a little bit better than that. That idea might be past its prime. I encourage you to check out my website. Again, my book will be coming out later this year, and I have links to some fun blogs and vlogs there. I also have a YouTube channel for kids. And as always, if you need an innovation coach or have a small group that wants a workshop, I'm here for you. Or if you have an event and you'd like an entertaining speaker, I have a wide variety of topics that I like to talk about. And I just like to strike back to that good news. Most effects of spaceflight do revert to pre-flight conditions within 6 months. When astronauts return to Earth, not all of them can walk. Few can, but some of them, their muscles have atrophied so much and they have so much space brain where they have equilibrium problems that they are actually wheelchairs whenever they step off their landing vehicle. Also, they are prohibited from driving for 2 months as they get their equilibrium back and shake off some of those effects of space brain. They do train in the pool, do physical therapy in the pool to counteract the muscle atrophy. The things that don't revert could be some of their vision changes, may or may not revert to pre-flight conditions, and their bone loss may or may not. Now, I'm using wiggle words because it depends on the age of the astronaut, depends on how much exercise they did, what kind of nutrition they had, and how long they were up there. And again, I don't have enough data points to say for sure which of these variables affect them the most. Tom Stafford passed away earlier this year, and so I wanted to remind you that the overview effect is one of the positive effects of space travel, and here are his words. It changes you. Oh, sure, changes your outlook. As you look back, you see a little blue and white baseball. Actually, it's smaller than a baseball, but it's hard to envision that is where all the people you've known all your life are, where you went to school, your friends, your family. It's also hard to envision that there are 3 billion people on that blue and white baseball. All right, now we're at the Q&A portion of the program. I'll pull up the chat and start there. Oh, you're welcome, Celia. That's so nice of you to say. And what if you already wear prescription contacts? Ellen, your vision might get worse because there's still fluid behind it. There still could be the flattening or rounding of the eyeball that changes the shape. And so, yeah, your vision could get worse. And based on the effects observed so far, do you think the astronauts on deep space missions will only be deployed once on such missions during their career? That's an interesting question, Rock, because right now we tend to keep astronauts to 6 months missions on the ISS. I say tend to, that's typical, because that way we limit their radiation exposure, we limit their microgravity exposure, and we minimize the effects of all of these things. Now, I already told you there have been exceptions to that. Mark Kelly went up there for 340 days. Peggy Whitson holds the record, and she has over 600 days in space on different missions, not consecutive. Mark Vanderhei was up there for about a year, Frank Rubio for over a year. So we've got a few different data points. I'm probably leaving a few out that we can see what the effects of longer than 6 months are. But now consider that it's 6 months to Mars and 6 months back. So even if they don't step foot off the spacecraft, that's a 1-year mission minimum. And you know, if I go on a vacation and if I drive an hour, I'm going to stay there at least 2 hours to make it worth the round trip of 2 hours. So if they're 6 months out and they want to stay for at least a year, that could be a 2-year mission. I'm not saying that that's what we're planning. I'm just saying it's going to be over a year for sure. And while we like to limit that, we also have to be realistic about our resources. If we spend the resources, the fuel, the labor hours, and all of the infrastructure to get a person from Earth to Mars and back again, we want to maximize that value by having them perform good science while they're there, or having them stay long enough to make that trip worthwhile. So we're struggling with that, quite frankly. That's why there's so many experiments around isolation studies. There's a number of different studies that talk about if you have people isolated from other people in space, hold on, there, analog studies, that's what I was trying to say. What happens to them? We're studying space radiation, distance from Earth. We talked about the Earth out of view phenomenon. So the reason that we're studying all these things is to prepare for those long duration space missions. And do I think that they're going to be limited? It depends on how we're able to counter all of these things, the radiation being the most difficult at this point in time. If we can figure out a way to protect delicate humans so that they can do 10-year Martian missions instead of just 2-year Martian missions, that could be a real game changer. So stay tuned as we work to counteract that. Mike, you have a question?
Yes, I just a comment, and that is there is an effect called the expansion effect, which is a extension of the overview effect when we go to Mars. When we go to Mars, I've suggested to NASA that we mount a camera in a position on the spacecraft to take time-lapse photography of the Earth as we leave the Earth and go to Mars, because over the days to get to Mars, which is at least 7 or 8 days, the Earth will fade down from a ball to a blue dot, and that'll have give a realization of entering the solar system, and that's kind of expanding, having an expansion effect. And I gave a paper to the Mars Society about this realization, and I could send you a copy of that paper if you like, but
Yeah.
It's a little different than the overview effect, and I'm wondering if it has any effect at all, that it would be an effect on the world's population of seeing the Earth fade away into a blue dot. And what do you think of that?
Well, I think that, again, the isolation and confinement is a problem. As I said, prisoners in solitary experience depression, anxiety. But the good news is all of these analog studies help us understand that and help us counter that and help us learn what works. And part of that is getting the right personalities of people together, and the right personalities that can handle those long duration missions. And another part of that is, you know, like you said, maybe taking pictures of Earth and having those available will help. Star Trek, I told you I was raised on Star Trek. The holodeck is so awesome. And I think having something like that where you can have a virtual vacation, even if it's just glasses instead of a whole room, is going to be essential to help people stay connected. The fact that there's a 23-minute lag in communication from Mars to Earth is going to be a real limiting factor. And Ray, a lot of movies have had humans go into deep sleep. I think there's a lot of risk in that, because if you put a person in a coma, there's always a chance they won't wake up. I happen to love Andy Weir, and he's the one that wrote The Martian. He also wrote Hail Mary. And in Hail Mary, they did exactly that. They put 3 different crew members in a coma, or basically a medically induced coma, and sent them into a deep space mission. And only one of the 3 woke up. Now, I know that's science fiction, that's not fact, but Andy does a lot of research in order to write his books. And if you look at the number of people who are in a coma now, I think that's a real concern.
Yeah, the expansion effect that I'm referring to is not so much the effect on the astronauts that are traveling, but the effect of a realization for the people on Earth to see the Earth fade away and realize that now we are a civilization that is entering the solar system and can explore the solar system and with the human beings, and therefore it might have an effect of bringing the people together on the Earth, so that the people on the Earth could take part in that realization that the astronauts have. That's the whole idea of the expansion effect.
I love that, Mike. And yeah, I'd love to read your paper. I think that's an optimistic viewpoint. I've read enough sci-fi where people are far enough away from Earth that they think the rules don't apply to them. So I'm concerned about the darker side. And I just like to balance. I like to look at both sides of things. Okay, and we have a question. Do you know if staying in space could cause dizziness? Well, again, it's that space brain. So if there's no up and down, it's hard for people to, actually their brain doesn't know how to handle that. So on the ISS, we actually designate ceiling and floor and walls to help counter that dizziness. And there's been studies where cosmonauts especially have sat on the bike and looked at a screen and exercised for 2 hours to help counter that motion sickness. So yeah, it's a real thing, but that's usually experienced immediately upon going into the International Space Station. Causing dizziness, it doesn't really cause, usually it's an immediate effect. It's not an after a while they develop the dizziness, unless it's a side effect of that fluid shift that we discussed. Okay, and Svetlana, answered much the same. So thank you. Oh, BB, you were so welcome. I appreciate you coming. And what's my opinion of having TV screens as a replacement for windows? I think it can help. And I say that as someone who has sat in an office with no windows. I appreciate pictures. I appreciate screens. Of course, there's no replacement for the real thing. I think if you're looking for something that helps, I think plants help. Plants help spruce up the office. We know that we can grow plants in microgravity. Green things make people smile, and added bonus, they help clean the air. And some of them we can eat. The best air scrubbers that NASA have found have been Pythos ivies and the snake plants, the mother-in-law's tongues. And so between I have both of those at home, and I give out Pythos ivies at the office to help clean the air there. FYI, that's not an enclosed environment, but the high CO2 levels in the ISS has been a concern. So I vote for more plants. Any other questions?
I have a question, if I can, please. The study of the day-night cycle on the human body. I know we've studied it at the Arctic Research Station, the effects of prolonged day and night, and surely we've studied it on the space stations. as you're approaching like a 2-hour day-night cycle. What are the anticipated effects as we move to other planets of that NASA is actually looking for? What the psychological and physiological effects that we know of?
Oh, yes, the circadian rhythm, that's a real thing. The circadian rhythm can cause, lack of sleep can cause a lot of bad things. And getting off the circadian rhythm can cause lack of sleep, which can cause the depression, the irritability, the degraded cognition, all the things. And so, yes, NASA has studied that. And that's one of the reasons why we have quiet time for the astronaut before bed. And then we have a designated 8-hour sleeping period for everyone. And then even if they don't sleep, it's designated at least. Jeff, there have been some studies, and I appreciate you saying that. I'm not an expert on that in particular. And again, we don't have as many data points in orbit as we do on the ground. But these analog studies show that people's circadian rhythms do get off in those environments. And some people have to take sleep aids. So we're trying all sorts of different things, from bungee cords to help keep them feeling like they're in on an in-gravity environment, to to medicines like melatonin and so forth. Thank you, Jeff, for that good question. I wish I could tell you more. Okay, this one hasn't been answered yet. A lot of the deep sleep, yes, I answered that. Going into a coma, I don't think it's feasible because some people won't wake up from the medical coma, and I think it's risky. Now, medical advancements happen all the time. If they can make it more reliable to get people out of a medical coma, maybe it's feasible. But as far as cryogenics, which is one way that the movies and books have put people to sleep, or cryogenics or deep freeze, I think that harms tissues, and I don't think that we are there yet. The science needs a lot of work. Do I have a link for the analog studies? Yeah, right there. www.nasa.gov/analog-missions, right there. Feel free to go there, and there's links to all sorts of missions. There's about one research paper I read said that there were 22 bases. And I don't know if that's currently active or if that's over the years, but I realized once I started going down this rabbit hole that this could be a whole nother hour-long talk, which is why I didn't include a bunch of slides about it, because it would have taken over the presentation. So thank you for that question. Recommend that virtual reality programs of hundreds of experience on Earth be stocked? Absolutely. So Mrs. Hansen mentioned that I have 5 patents awarded, and one of those include the next best thing to a holodeck. It's actually an Iron Man type suit that includes augmented reality, and there's a number of reasons for this suit called Vitae. One would be augmented strength to help unload or move cargo around once we reach Mars. Another one of these would be for exercise. If you actually have a suit that provides resistance, it can be used for exercise. Another reason is for learning, for maintenance. You got to go perform, you got to go change a filter out. Well, you don't want to break the filter. So if you can practice using this robotic suit, then you can learn and make mistakes before you actually touch hardware. And then personal training for exercise, and also for virtual escapes. So virtual vacations. If you can have, as you say, hundreds of experience of Earth stocked, then you can go to Hawaii, or you can go to Thailand virtually. And that gets you out of that space habitat for at least a little while, so that if your crewmates are driving you completely bonkers, you can get away from them. Or if the isolation of the spacecraft makes you long for a hike up the mountains, you can do that virtually. So I absolutely agree, Cindy, that's going to be essential.
I don't see any more questions. And I want to thank you, Julie, for coming and sharing your knowledge, what you have experienced both firsthand with and yourself on zero gravity flight, as well as interacting with various astronauts, crew members that have participated in flights, and then also from the publications. So thanks a lot. I will post your contact. So for those that will want to reach out and continue either interaction or share various events that you may be able to or would like to participate. And please do come back. And everyone, thank you for joining today. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this of our meeting, that we host these meetings every Saturday. On some Saturdays we have speakers like today, Julie, thank you. And on others, we just get together and share interact informally. Ellen, do you have a question or comment? I'm going to stop the recording.
You can stop the recording.